Good afternoon, viewers. We're here on behalf of the Living History Program of the Wood Library Museum, Park Ridge, Illinois. I'm Bradley Smith. I'm co-chair of the Committee on Living History of Anesthesia, and I'm here with two of the most distinguished of my many friends. We're here to interview Dr. Ronald L. Katz, and from henceforth he shall be known as Ron to me. And he's going to be interviewed by me and by our other friend, Dr. Theodore H. Stanley, hereafter to be known as Ted, who's professor of anesthesiology at the University of Utah and is also the founder and the chairman of the board of ZARS. And they're going to call me sir. Okay, I do want to say that our interviewee, in all great seriousness, is truly one of the great people of our generation in anesthesiology. And he is well known to almost everybody contemporary, but since we hope this record will go on for many decades, we're going to take the time to fill in where he came from, what he became, as well as give you quite a few little personal things that he might better left unsaid, but we're going to be sure we drag it out into the open anyway, because we're all friends. Now, Ron, where'd you start in life? New York City? I can't believe that you're a New Yorker.
I was born in Brooklyn, New York, a long time ago.
Is it going to be hard to drag things out of you? Are you going to say yes and no from now on?
Brad, you know me too well to know that's not me.
I know the one thing that has given me problems my entire life, and that is that you're 8 months younger than I am and have accomplished so much more than I have. Let's see, now you started your accomplishments even before you thought of becoming a physician. I happen to know, one day we were driving down, I think it was 53rd Street, I believe, and you looked up, is it 53rd, is that where this building is? I'm going to say, is it 53rd?
Oh, 58th Street.
58th Street. 57th Street in New York
57.
City. We looked up to our left, and Ron casually said, oh yes, I gave a concert there when I was 14. Is that my recollection right? Tell me about this.
Close. Actually, I did a violin concert at Carnegie Hall when I was about 9 or 10 years old. 9 or 10? Right.
And how did you become such a virtuoso so early?
It really was a scam. There were people who had a contest, and I think they were trying to sell violin lessons, but they held a contest, and the 3 winners of the contest got to go to and take lessons at Carnegie Hall. I came in second. A guy named Hugh Brown came in first. I was in second place, and Warren Weinstein was in third place. I had lessons at Carnegie Hall. My mentor was Yasha Heifetz.
Oh my God,
and,
really?
That career started when I was about 5 or 6. At about 8 or 9, I played Carnegie Hall. I did a concert at Town Hall where I was half the concert and Lily Pons was the other half of the concert. And at the age of 11, I gave up the violin. I actually smashed the violin on the bedpost, swore I would never play it again, and I never did play it again.
Is it true that the posters said Little Ronnie Katz? Is that what the posters said?
I don't think I could read at that time. I don't remember what the posters said, frankly.
Well, so then you did that to get into another career, and what was that career? Not medicine.
That other career was baseball, and I'll explain why I smashed the violin. I live near Ebbets Field, in an area called the Parade Grounds, and on the weekend I would go there at 8 o'clock in the morning, play one baseball game, then another and another between 8 and 6 o'clock or whenever it got dark, and I would do the same thing on Sunday. A scout from the Brooklyn Dodgers saw me, was interested. My father had been a semi-pro right fielder. By semi-pro, I mean he had a job during the week, but on the weekend he would play baseball on Sundays. And from when I was 2 years old, he began to hit balls toward me, pitch toward me, and teach me. And so my mother wanted me to be a violinist. My father wanted me to play shortstop for the Dodgers, and they were grooming me to be Pee Wee Reese's replacement. And I was torn between violin and baseball, and the two were incompatible, because in baseball I would injure this finger, and this was a fingering finger on the violin.
Of course.
So to end the problem, I took the violin, smashed it on the bedpost, and swore I would never play the violin again. I did continue playing baseball in high school, college, and with my residents until about 10 years ago I stopped playing with my residents.
Well, that's wonderful. Audience, I'm not leaving Dr. Stanley out of this. It's just that he comes into this narrative just a little bit later. Once we get him started, he will be hard to stop, believe me. Let's see now. You went then to University of Wisconsin, is that right, for your undergraduate?
Right, and the reason I went there was I grew up with the Gallo brothers and thought the Gallo gang was pretty cool. I had a high school teacher whose name I've forgotten, who told my parents that it was important that I got out of New York, otherwise I might grow up to be a gangster in the gang. And so I ended up going to the University of Wisconsin, which was a milieu totally different from New York, and that's how I got to Wisconsin.
Ron, did you have any contact whatsoever with the medical school or with the Department of Anesthesiology when you were at Wisconsin?
You know, you just reminded me of something that I hadn't thought of a long time. One of the famous groups in anesthesia was Orth, Hathaway, and I forget someone else who wrote some classic papers. My advisor was one of those people, but I had no idea that they had anything to do with anesthesia. They were just a teacher of mine. It was only many years later that I was reading the old literature that I realized my teacher at Wisconsin was famous in anesthesia.
Maybe you learned by osmosis and didn't know it.
Maybe he...
How'd you get interested in going into medicine?
Well, I decided that baseball, I'd be washed up by 30 or 35. That wasn't a very long career. I'd already given up the violin.
And besides, you had competition from Leo Durocher coming into that team.
Well, he was a lot older than I was,
all right.
But I think I was a better shortstop
than
he was. Maybe not a better hitter, but a better fielder. I actually was going to be a genetics major, get a PhD in genetics, but then I had a problem with one of the teachers in the department who threw me out of the class because he wouldn't let me audit the course, and my advisor said, if you get a PhD, he'll be on your committee, and you know he doesn't like you, and maybe you should do something else. And I said, well, instead of getting a PhD, I'll get an M.D. and I can still you know, do my work.
How'd you go about choosing a medical school?
That's an interesting question. I had already been accepted after 3 years of college into one medical school, which shall remain nameless. It wasn't the world's greatest medical school, but it was a grade A medical school. So I was pretty cool and relaxed when I went on my interviews the following year. They said that they would save my place for another year. I went to Boston. I interviewed at all three medical schools, and the dean of the medical school who interviewed me at Boston University was a young guy, and his first question to me was, Mr. Katz, it's 12:30 midnight Saturday. What are you doing? You're at the corner of Lake and Langdon. What are you doing? And I looked at him. I said, you really want to know? He said, yeah, I really want to know. I said, well, I'm kissing my date and trying to get to first or second base with her. And he then asked me about, you know, what else I didn't. He said, I see You were on the baseball team, you were on the crew team. Well, I didn't know it at the time, but he had been at the University of Wisconsin. He was on the crew team, and we just fit beautifully. At the end of the interview, he said, well, you've accomplished quite a lot. I hope you'll come to our medical school next year. And I said, do you tell that to everybody to be nice, or do you really mean it? And he said, no, I really mean it. And I was so impressed with him. I said, well, give me a week. I'm pretty sure I want to come to where you are. I was accepted at Harvard. I was accepted at Yale, at Tufts. I didn't go to Yale, but I went to BU because I loved the dean who chose me, and he was a great guy. It turned out, we found out, it took us 4 years to figure it out, that everyone in my medical school class had played a varsity sport in college. And when we accosted him with that information, he said, well, anyone with a good IQ who works hard can get good grades, but people who can do sports, spend the time doing a varsity sport, and get good grades, they're the kind of people I want.
You had other famous anesthesiologist classmates at your Boston University class.
Yeah, George Petit was a classmate of mine. He was at the Mass General for a minute. He still is at the Mass General. Jerry Strong was at Baylor, and then was at UC San Francisco before he retired. Yeah, it's happenstance. I don't know why.
Interesting, isn't it? Interesting. Well, Ron, how did you decide to go into anesthesiology?
Well, it's going to sound very similar to Ted's story. I was going to be a surgeon. Why was I going to be a surgeon? Well, first of all, in medical school, I said, when we were talking about what we're going to go into, I said there are two fields I know I'm not going to do, dermatology or anesthesiology. You know, they're terrible fields. I decided on surgery, as many people decide on a field because of someone they respect. Our professor of surgery, J.J. Byrne, was a fantastic man. I mean, we all loved him. And so I had already secured a residency in surgery with him at the Boston City Hospital. But as a medical student, we had to do some surgery-related elective. And no one wanted to do anesthesia. You could do head and neck, you could do radiology, anesthesia, a few others. We drew straws. I drew the shortest straw, and the only one left for me was anesthesiology. And I said, no, I don't want to do anesthesiology. I'll trade you my firstborn son, you know, anything. And no one would trade with me. So I ended up having to do anesthesiology, and I was miserable. Fortunately, I was assigned to a gentleman named Arthur Ogden, who was a young assistant professor, and I was his little puppy dog. I followed him around everywhere, and it seemed the hospital couldn't run without him. We didn't have pagers in those days, so there was an overhead page, and every 5 minutes, paging Dr. Ogden. There was a hemophiliac kid that no one could draw blood on. They called Art Ogden to do it. I went with him. There were patients where the neurologist couldn't do a spinal tap to make a diagnosis. They called Dr. Ogden to do it. It was the time of the polio epidemic. We had patients on respirators, those old drinker respirators. They called Dr. Ogden to intubate the patient and put them. And he was like the most important person in the hospital. I decided I want to be like him when I grow up. And so I went back to, you know, Professor Byrne, and I said, sir, you know, I've changed my mind. I want to go into anesthesia. And he looked at me and he said, okay, I'll support it. His letter to Manny Papper was a very short one. I always wanted Ron to be a surgeon. We need good people in anesthesia. Take him, and signed it. And Dr. Papper showed me the letter, said, what could be a better letter of recommendation? So it was fortuitous. And it's interesting that Ted and I both started off in surgery, but then saw the true light later on.
Well then, I know that you went to Staten Island for your internship, but I don't know why. Why did you go to Staten Island for an internship?
At the time I was married, I had one child, and I had $17,000 in debt. Well, that doesn't sound like a lot when today my medical students graduate with $150,000. But if you take $17,000 in 1956 and extrapolate it, it's about $150,000. And remember, my first salary at Columbia as a professor was $8,000. So the $17,000 was a lot. In those days, internships were $50 a month and laundry, whereas in the service, it was $6,000. So I decided to go into the public health service, and they assigned me to Staten Island.
Did they sponsor or in any way have anything to do with you going to Columbia University?
No, they didn't. Actually, this is also bizarre. I found out that there was a brilliant researcher at the NIH, which is part of the public health service at that time, named John Severinghouse, and I was going to be his fellow when I finished. And at the last minute, they changed their mind, and they were going to send me on a destroyer somewhere out off the Prevalov Islands. So they released me from my contract, and at the last minute, I looked around for residency and got one at Columbia University.
I'm smiling because you know how similar our histories are. I went into the U.S. Navy for $6,500 a year for that very same reason. That 1 year difference separated from you, and our paths then crossed for the first time when I did some training at Columbia and then the fellowship at Columbia. And although you were 8 months younger, you were already my faculty attending. And we didn't really have too much contact at that time, but soon after that, you came into contact with an extremely famous and somewhat talkative friend of ours. Ted, you're here. Excuse me. Ted Stanley. When do you first remember Ron?
I first met Ron in June of 1963, and I remember that very distinctly because I was a junior medical student who was just starting junior year. And in those days, I was at Columbia, and in those days, you had an option of having an elective in third year. And it turned out that this elective was 3 months, and I got it as the first part of my junior year. And that was decided in February or sometime around that before. And so I was trying to decide what I was going to do for this elective. And one of my co-students said, you know, you're interested in surgery. I was interested in surgery. You should probably look into this anesthesiology preceptorship that they have. It goes for 3 months, and, you know, anesthesiology is close to surgery. So that sounded like a good idea, and I called up the department, and lo and behold, the secretary at the time sent me to an assistant professor that all of us know, Dr. Richard Kitts, who at that time was managing this program for the chairman of the department, Manny Papper. And so Kitts and I met for breakfast early one morning in March, and he said, oh yeah, I used to be in neurosurgery, and you want to go to the ORs in anesthesiology. Well, you know, in those days, anesthesiology was really hungry for American medical students who were interested in anesthesiology. And so I didn't know that, but it sounded great. And at that time, Dr. Papper, who was an icon, as you all know, had this program set up such that any medical student who started would, for the first 4 or 5 weeks of this 3-month elective, spend one-on-one time with a faculty member for an entire week. And that faculty had no other responsibilities except that medical student. Now, he did anesthesia that week with the medical student one-on-one. So my first week was with Dick Kitts, who was a charming guy at that time and still is, and we had wonderful discussions. My second week was with Ron Katz. And so I was with Ron for about 10 to 12 hours a day, every day, for a week. And this allowed us to get to know each other really well. And it turned out that I liked baseball, I was a musician, and medicine was my third choice. And it was kind of almost a similar story. I was a baseball player. I grew up in Brooklyn, and so we interacted and discussed these issues. And I was very naive at that time in dating, because my dad and mom were police people, and I was in a very structured environment. And so I asked Ron for some guidance, tips on how to go about dating. Now, I'm 23 years old at this time, and I still had many dates in my life, but this was a man of the world. At least I thought so at that time. And so we talked about everything. We talked about baseball, we talked about medicine, we talked about women, we talked about everything you could conceive of. And Ron's charm charmed me, and I finished my fellowship, and then a couple of years later, I started in surgery, and a couple of years later I came back, and Ron continued to be my mentor for the rest of my life.
Well, we're going to be moving on to some other things. So while we're here, I know that you have some, I hesitate to say dirt, that you want to tell us about Ron during those years, and I think this would be a good time to get it on the camera.
Oh, there's no dirt. Ron is an interesting, exciting man who has an opinion about everything. And I was impressed with Ron's ability to, in those days, tell a surgeon that he was wrong. And I was impressed by his abilities to stand up for what was right. Ron was a researcher. He was a clinical researcher. And he looked at every patient as someone you could learn material from. That every patient showed you new materials. And Ron would monitor and study just about every patient that I anesthetized with him. And that was very impressive to me, because research was important to him. And it was clinical research, and it was important because it showed him and me, by being with him, that you could get more and more information from patients, and that was valuable in teaching you how to be a better doctor and how to be a better anesthesiologist. And that was very, very impressive to me.
I think of three major areas that he was really into at that time. You probably have more. I'm going to say in a few minutes that he became a chairman of a department in 1973. The reason was because he had accomplished so much between that time that you mentioned in 1973. Why don't you tell us about some of the things that you were working on in those years?
Most people, know my research in neuromuscular transmission, and what I consider my real research was my research on neurophysiology of respiration, the pneumataxic center, the apneutic center, and the brain, and then work that I did on coronary blood flow and circulation. Very few people in anesthesia know about that, because that was published in physiology and pharmacology journals. And I remember Dr. Papper telling me that you need to publish an anesthesia journal so people know you. And I remember brashly stating, my work is too good for anesthesia journals. I want it in the basic science journals.
Sounds just like both of you, as a matter of fact.
And I had 50% time in the research lab. The other 50% of the time, I was in the operating room. And as Ted pointed out, and as I teach in pharmacology today, you know, I write on the board, every anesthetic is an experiment or research in physiology or pharmacology, because you never know how a patient is going to respond. And so that's how I felt that you could learn. I also got bored very easily, and I had some surgeons who were really very slow, and nothing happened, and I was looking for something to do. Well, when I was a resident, and this is how I got into neuromuscular transmission, which most people know before, but that was my clinical research. I got into it because one day Saul Schneider, the great obstetrical anesthesiologist, Saul and I were residents together, and we were buddies. Manny Papper assigned me to kind of shepherd Saul around, because Saul came from a little town in Canada coming to the big city. And so Saul and I became friends. We went to I introduced him to opera. We went to Tanglewood together. And one day, Saul was doing a case with a surgeon, and the surgeon was screaming at him, you know, more relaxation, the patient's tight, da 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 da. And Saul kept giving more muscle relaxant. He was very upset. And because of the large amount, Saul was literally in tears in the recovery room, because now the patient wasn't breathing because he had gotten so much muscle relaxant. And I was sent in to do his next case with the same surgeon. And the same surgeon began to yell at me, and at one point he said, "This patient is not relaxed, I can't operate." And I was a resident and he was the attending. And I said, "Sir, your first statement is wrong, your second statement is correct." I got into a little bit of trouble for that. Dr. Papper called me and asked me if I'd really said it, and I said, yes, I did. I said, but it was the truth. It was the truth. And I went home that night, and I thought, you know, we have these fights all the time. There's got to be a better way to give muscle relaxant instead of, you know, guessing. And so I remember in pharmacology, we stimulated a nerve in a dog. We got a muscle response and recorded it. And I thought, why can't we do it in people? And so I went home and built in my garage a peripheral nerve stimulator, and we stimulated at the wrist. And I got a force displacement transducer, and we measured the force of contraction, and we gave relaxants till it, you know, disappeared. And I remember I would ask the residents, you know, what would you like to see today? What can we try today? What combination of drugs? What doses can we use? And that's really how I got into neuromuscular transmission.
Let me interrupt.
Yeah, Ted.
Ron had a cart that was about 6 feet long and about 3 foot high, and it had every kind of monitoring device you could conceive of, and some that you couldn't conceive of. And so he could monitor anything and everything. And so as a resident, it was fun to work with Ron Katz, because he was monitoring a ton of different things. And, you know, after we put the patient to sleep and everything was stable, we had these surgeons that took all day to do nothing, a little case. And so you could try and develop new techniques as Ron was doing. And you would often have an arterial line in a patient and have direct blood pressure monitoring. Oh, in those days, that was the cat's meow of stuff. And you know,
K-A-T-Z, meow.
and so it was very fun to be, other than the fact that the cases went on forever, but doing the anesthetic, you were always looking at different ways of doing things, different ways of monitoring patients. And so it was fun and mentally stimulating for residents to be in that environment. And even when Ron was not the attending on the case, I remember Jerry Wolf, not Jerry Wolf,
Chuck Wolf.
Charlie
Chuck
Wolf, down on the, what was it, the
third floor.
Third floor. And Charlie would be paired with Ron, and on non-clinical days, Ron would sometimes come in, even though he wasn't giving anesthesia, to teach the residents how to do certain things, or with his big cart, and you say, "Oh my, Ron Katz is here. We're going to have fun today," because there was always something new and different, and it was mind stimulating. It was great.
Well, we all profited from your curiosity. There are 2 or 3 other things you were doing during that period that I think we ought to mention. I've always admired the fact that you went to the pharmacist and made them ground up nitroprusside, because nobody could get it any other place, and you had the foresight to know that we needed that. You did that during that period of time.
I read some articles by Irving Page where he had worked with this drug nitroprusside. The drug was not available. It came in a tablet, and I thought that this drug could be very good for controlling blood pressure. At the time, we were using ganglionic blockers, arfinad, pentylinium, C6, and I read these articles, and I later on did some research. My thesis was, we measure blood pressure because it's easy, but that's not really what we want to know. We want to know blood flow. And I did a study in the dog where we produced the same blood pressure with nitroprusside or with arfinad. And with arfinad, blood flow to the brain, the heart, the kidneys, the liver all went down, and all the blood, or most of the blood, went to skin and muscle, which is not what you want. Whereas with nitroprusside, the same blood pressure had flow maintained to the heart, the brain, the kidney, and it shunted blood away from skin and muscle. And so I thought, this is a better drug to use to produce hypotension. We had a big pheochromocytoma group. The urologists, and I worked with the urologists a lot. I was in charge of urologic anesthesia. They did all the pheochromocytomas. And so I went to the pharmacist and asked him, would he grind up in a mortar and pestle the drug, put it in a solution for me, and we showed that it worked very well for
needless to say, we couldn't
pheochromocytomas.
do that today because of we're being protected by the federal government from wild-eyed people like you. But at any rate, the other thing you did was somehow you knew about the calabar bean, and somehow you knew about ezarine, and somehow you resurrected it back into the practice of medicine.
That was also a bit of a fluke. We had a big Parkinson group at Columbia, and one day one of the neurologist psychiatrists called me. He had a patient who had Parkinsonism who took Cogentin, which is an atropine, like drug, and the patient's rigidity improved. So the patient decided, I'm less rigid with this dose, I'll just take a bigger dose. And the patient ended up overdosing himself and basically was in wild delirium. And the neurologist, Roger Duvoisin, called me, and he said, I've got a crazy patient here. And I said, so what? I mean, you're a psychiatrist. It's not a surprise. And he told me what happened, and he said, help me. I was in the OR at the time, actually, but I had good residents in each room, and so I said I could leave them. And I thought, okay, too much atropine, so he's short of acetylcholine. And I thought of grabbing neostigmine, but then I thought, no, neostigmine is a quaternary, so that won't pass the blood-brain barrier, and he's gone crazy. So I need something that goes past the blood-brain barrier. In my research lab, I had been studying physostigmine, which is a tertiary amine. I thought, oh, the physostigmine might work. So I ran to my lab, grabbed the physostigmine, ran to the outpatient clinic, and injected the physostigmine. And within 2 minutes, the patient looked up and said, excuse me, but why are you 6 gentlemen holding me down here? He was perfectly rational. And
That's so wonderful.
I went back to the OR, and
yes, Ted.
That's how it got started.
I think the people who are listening to this might want to appreciate just the way anesthesia was at Columbia in those days. It was probably the most magnificent department there ever was, and maybe never will be again, because the number of people that were kind of like Ron Katz were dozens, it seemed.
Amazing.
And, you know, in those days, the journal Anesthesiology was published by, you know, half of it was from, every issue was from the Department of Anesthesiology at Columbia. And to be a resident in that environment was inspiring, because one day you'd be with Ron Katz, next day you'd be with Bob Epstein, next day you'd be with Dick Kitts, and on and on and on.
Sushin Nye, Jack Fruman.
Absolutely.
Ray Fink.
And these people were doing things and had done things that were in the literature for the 10 years beforehand, were in the literature right now. And each of them, as I recall, and it's a long time ago, each of them would spend half of their time in the lab and half of their time in the OR.
It was a wonderful environment.
It was unbelievable.
Now, Ron, in addition to that, did you get your medical hypnosis started at that same time?
You know, I thought hypnosis was BS, and there was a psychiatrist giving a course in hypnosis, and one of my fellow faculty, Linda Hines, was taking the course. She had actually been my fellow, and now she had joined the faculty, and she said, Ron, it's 9 to 12 on Saturdays, come with me, we'll take the course together. I went and introduced myself to the teacher of the course, who was a psychiatry professor, and said, I want you to know that I'm here because I think hypnosis is bullshit and it's a fraud, but I want to learn more about it so I can expose your fraudulent thing. And he looked at me and said, well, I've heard of you, sir, and you know, if I can't convince you this is real, I'll have to reevaluate what I'm doing. And I thought, more psychiatric bullshit, you know, he hasn't won me over. But I was fair. I listened to him, and I began to try some of the things. And actually, by the third meeting, he said, has anyone used hypnosis? And I raised my hand, and I told him how I'd use it to calm a patient. I ended up taking the course. The following year, I gave the course with him and taught hypnosis at Columbia for many years. When I went to UCLA, I taught a course in hypnosis, partly because I thought every doctor should know how to use hypnosis, and partly it was a way to get at the first-year medical students, because, you know, as Ted has pointed out, recruiting was a problem. We sometimes didn't get the best people going into anesthesia, and so I decided that, you know, getting them young was important. So I taught in physiology and pharmacology at Columbia, and I taught an evening course in hypnosis. A lot of first-year medical students came, and a lot of them went into anesthesia.
And you moved this into publications, I believe, as well.
I wrote several articles on the use of hypnosis for pain relief. I did about 8 or 10 operations solely under hypnosis, and actually I made a film of an operation carried out under hypnosis. And the best part of the film, I think, is the look on the surgeon's face, you know, when he asked the patient, you know, how was it? And she looks up at him and she said, well, I don't know. I was off on a skiing trip during the surgery, and, you know, he just shook his head and walked away. So, yeah, I used hypnosis, and originally I didn't believe in it.
And you also were into acupuncture about the same period of time.
Again, I thought acupuncture was just Chinese hypnosis. And so I decided to do a study as to whether it was just another form of hypnosis or separate. And without going into the details of the study, I was wrong. The conclusion of my hypothesis was acupuncture is a form of hypnosis. The conclusion of my paper is I'm wrong. My hypothesis is wrong. It's totally separate. I did 5 operations solely under acupuncture at Columbia. When I got to UCLA, they didn't believe it. They said, we want to see you do it here. So I did operations under acupuncture at UCLA, and then they believed it.
I want to ask you an embarrassing question. Did you hypnotize Dr. Ted Stanley?
Well, it has been suggested by many people that I lure them into anesthesia by hypnotizing them.
How about that, Ted?
No, I was suspicious of hypnosis, but after listening to Ron many times, I became a believer. I never did it myself, but I believe there's a place, and there's a reason for it, although I don't totally understand the reason. I'd like to mention one thing that I think is one of Ron's, in my opinions, more important studies. I won't say it's the most important, but it's a very important study which not a lot of people remember, especially today. And he went and he did a sabbatical. I think it was in the UK.
London.
And then he did a study that compared the responses of Londonites to one or more muscle relaxants. I think it was curare. And then he compared it to the same study done in New York. And he found that there was a very significant difference in what people in London required as compared to people in New York. It was much higher, maybe twice as much muscle relaxant to get the same degree of paralysis. And then he followed that up by another study after he moved to Los Angeles, which compared what people in New York required and people in Los Angeles, and there was no difference. And this is not mentioned very frequently, but it's a profound study because with another drug, many years later, I found a similar kind of difference between people in Utah requiring fentanyl. Now, I had a different population, a population that had less exposure to, because of the Mormon religion, to coffee and to alcohol and to other materials. But in my case, the people in Holland required 3 times as much of a different drug than the people in Utah. And these are very important clinical differences that we don't know all the reasons. I believe habits play an important part in the sensitivity of the central nervous system. If you drink a lot of alcohol, if you smoke, if you take other stimulants or depressants, you can change the sensitivity of the nervous system to many of the kinds of drugs that we use. And Ron, I believe, was the first one to point that out.
The interesting thing, Ted, was when I submitted that paper for publication, I couldn't get it published. All the reviews said, this is ridiculous. Finally, the editor of Anesthesiology said, I don't believe it, I think it's wrong, but I can't see what you did wrong, so we're going to publish it and put it out there. And the interesting thing is that many years later, Ted, you showed the identical thing with opioids, and Francois Donati, who was in Montreal and then was going on a sabbatical to Paris, I said, Francois, and he was doing muscle relaxants, I said, Francois, why don't you, repeat my study with vecuronium or whatever you want to do it now. Francois did the same study, and if you put his dose response curves in my Montreal versus Paris on my paper of New York versus London, they're identical. They're right over each other. And finally, when Francois published his paper, and when you published your paper, then people said, yeah, maybe that old paper is right after all.
I mean, it's a very profoundly important study, in my opinion. And the thing that, when I found this, I remember, because I was reading in those days all of Ron's publications, and I said, my goodness, that's exactly what Ron found with a muscle relaxant. So this is a very profound thing that I don't think that current clinicians pay enough attention to.
But at any rate, you had some problems at UCLA, but again, you triumphed over all resistance and developed a marvelous department. What are some of the highlights you remember about not only your own accomplishments, but some of the things you did with the department there?
Well, first of all, it was a division, and I told the dean that you know, it would be unacceptable to come as a division. Anesthesia had to be a department, and the dean said okay, he would do it. I don't want it to sound bad, but when I got to UCLA, the CEO of the hospital, Baldy Lamson, took me around, showed me the equipment, said, what do you think of this? And I said, this is wonderful. I love this equipment. It's the finest equipment of the 1960s. We'll make a museum of it. UCLA was behind in terms of equipment, and that was true of California in general, from what I observed. And the practices, I told the dean, I said, this is going to be easy, sir, because what you're doing now in the 1970s is what we were doing in the 60s at Columbia. I know what we're doing now at Columbia. I can bring you from 1961 to 73 in a year or two. I remember the first time we were doing a carotid endarterectomy, and the surgeon was watching me, and I put a needle in the artery. And the surgeon said, oh, you got the artery. And I said, yes, sir, we'll discuss it later. And he was a good surgeon, good guy. He didn't say a word, but afterwards he said, why'd you put the needle in the artery? And being who I am, I said, because I'm trying to bring UCLA up into the 20th century in anesthesia. And I said, rather than argue about it now, why don't you invite me to give a lecture on the use and abuse of arterial lines in medicine? And I gave that lecture. Interesting enough, a year later, the same surgeon came to me to complain. He said, I did a carotid and your resident did put in an arterial line. And I said, wait a second, is this the same Wiley H. Barker who a year ago screamed at me because I did put in an arterial line, and now you're screaming because my resident didn't put one in? He said, you're damn right, it's the same guy, and I've learned a lot in a year. So in a sense, it was easy. A lot of the things that were normal at Columbia, I was able to introduce at UCLA.
Tell us about some of your residents and your faculty colleagues.
We had very good residents, and it's a theory of mine. I've been to other places where the residents were superb, but I didn't think the department was first rate. And when I asked them, you know, why do you pick this place? Well, I had this conversation last night with the new chairman at Irvine, and he said, we have wonderful residents at Irvine, even though the department has been in the newspaper for big problems. Location, location, location. What I had going at UCLA was a wonderful location. People wanted, you know, the weather was great. You could play tennis all year round. You could ski in the morning and go swimming in the afternoon. We were able to get very good residents. And I've been accused, as you suggested earlier, of hypnotizing people into coming into anesthesia. So right from the get-go, I was able to get very good residents.
I wanted to add that what Ron said before in terms of the department at Columbia not being quite as good after Manny left was very true. And one of the advantages that Ron had is that there were a lot of people in Columbia who admired him of the group. And so there was a reasonable number of people who came from Columbia to UCLA after he was there, or actually as he went there. And so this was like Columbia West for a while, and grew from that. So Ron had the ability to bring a substantial number of people. I don't remember how many, but
I can tell you exactly.
You might want to do that, Ron. I mean, just to
You know what? The other day, actually, the wife, Jordan Miller's wife, you remember
Yeah,
Jordan,
sure.
who came with me. You know, Dick Kitts, I got Dick into anesthesia. He was going to be a surgeon, and I one day, you know, leaned over and said, "Hey, Kitts, you're on the wrong side of the blood-brain barrier," and he laughed. And I said, "The fact that you laughed shows that you're too smart to be a surgeon." And you know, I hassled and hustled him for a long time. Dick and I were great friends. We drove to work together for about 6 years, because we only had one car in the family. So, but nevertheless, there's a little bit of competition. And Bob Epstein, who was my first attending, we're very close. There was a competition, and what I always pointed out to them is that when I left Columbia, and I was the last one to leave, I took more people from Columbia to UCLA than they took to Virginia or to Mass General. The exact number is 13. So 13 of my students, you know, residents from Columbia came to UCLA with me.
Was Lenny Waltz a Columbia guy?
Len Waltz, no, Len Waltz was at UCLA before I came, but Len and I had become friends because he was interested in muscle relaxants, and Len had pushed for me since he knew me well.
Go ahead, Ted.
It was so interesting because I got to be a visiting professor after Ron went there, and it was like going home to Columbia because all the faculty were there. Some of them were my residents. Some were residents with me. So it was very nice to go to UCLA because I was going home.
Because of those things and because of your new success at UCLA, you began to get very wide international recognition. I won't stop here and make a long list of all your accomplishments and awards and that sort of thing, but you certainly were very active in the Society for Academic Anesthesia chairman. I remember you well, always a voice for the right, even if the other people didn't recognize what the right was. You were a very powerful voice in many organizations. You had a great deal to do with research committees in the ASA. What other organizational work were you into at that time?
You know, I'm really not an organizational man. I hate organizations. I have a theory in life that most of the time the majority of people are going in the wrong direction. And most organizations, you know, I've defined...
Wait, does this include when they're following you?
No, that's different.
All right.
You know, we talk about committees, and I talk about, you know, I have frequently said a camel is a horse designed by a committee. I'm opposed to committees, and when I am in charge of a committee, I'm usually a dictator. And I told the faculty at UCLA, I'm a dictator, but a benevolent one.
But nonetheless, I know they made you chief of staff at that hospital.
Yeah, but you know, they did it illegally. I was away on sabbatical. I came back from sabbatical, and they said, "Oh, by the way, you were elected the next chief of staff." And I said, "Can't be, because I never signed a statement saying that if elected I would serve." They said, "Oh, we signed it for you." And at that time, you were only chief of staff for a year. They hated me so much that at the end of the year, they voted me in for second term, the first time ever. And I really wasn't very nice as chief of staff. I was totally autocratic, and I announced, "We're going to discuss something. When I have decided that everything has been said that can be said and people are repeating themselves in different words, I'm going to cut you off." And frequently someone would get up, start to talk, say, "We already heard that, sit down." And I was famous or infamous. No meeting of the chairs of the faculty staff ever went more than an hour.
Ron, about that same time, outside the hospital, you became a fabulously wealthy banker.
Well, I don't know about Ted's the one who's he's more fabulously wealthy than I am. But this man came to see me, and he said that he'd been told to talk to me because I had some ideas. And what had happened was I went to my bank across the street from the hospital, and I wanted to deposit a check. And they asked me for identification. And I was in my scrub suit. And I said, I don't have any identification. It's only a $300 check, and I'm putting it in. I'm not cashing it. I'm putting it in my account. And they said, well, we can't take it. We still need identification. And I said, you know, I have 10 minutes between cases. Get me the manager. The manager came over. What's the problem? Same thing. Sorry, sir, we need it. So I said, okay, we have 3 minutes left. In the next 3 minutes, either you put this check in, or else I leave here. Tomorrow, when I have more time, I withdraw my account. And he said, I'm sorry, we have our rules. And I said, I have my rules. I don't deal with idiot bankers. I was having dinner that night with some other physicians, and one of them said, I can't believe what happened with my bank today. And he told his story. And it became, can you top this? The next guy said something, next guy said something, I told my story, and someone, we don't remember who, they claim it was me, but we had a lot of wine. Someone said, we should start our own bank for doctors. You know, who the hell can go to the bank between 9 and 3? You know, it's ridiculous. And so we then got a real banker, because we needed a real banker to fill out. By the way, there were 438 forms we had to fill out to start the bank. Tremendous bureaucracy. But I did a survey. I asked people, doctors at the hospital, what do you hate about your bank? And they told me. And then we organized our bank to do all the things that people hated. You didn't have to come to the bank. We had people, bonded men and women, who would come to your house, to your office, to do business, and they wore green jackets. I picked green for money and green for oxygen. And you could do your banking any hour of the day by just picking up the phone and calling the banker. And so I was on the board of the bank. I was one of the founding members of the bank. I was on the board for 18 years. After 18 years, we were bought out by a bigger bank, but I traded my stock in the old bank for the new bank, and I'm still slightly involved.
That stock you bought isn't Lehman Brothers, is it?
No. Our bank never did any mortgage-backed securities, so our bank is doing great.
Well, that's
now.
Wonderful. Another thing that you were into, and probably are still into, is you were doing some writing that was non-medical writing.
Yeah, not too many, maybe 5 people know about it. I can't remember when I told you that. I'm a short story writer.
You trusted me never to tell a soul. That's why you told me.
Right, and you're telling the world now. I've written and published short stories under a pseudonym. I've collected them.
It's not Kurt Vonnegut, is it?
No,
okay.
No. It's
never
not,
mind.
It's not T.C. Boyle either.
All right.
If ever it becomes a bestseller, I will announce to the world, hey, look, that's me, that's my pseudonym. If that doesn't happen, no one will ever know what my pseudonym is.
Well, this is uncharacteristically playing things safe and cozy. It's not like you.
That's because that's not my area of expertise.
I would like to turn the conversation back to more serious levels. You have very deservedly won Lord knows how many awards and accolades and honorary thises and that's. Rather than to list the long list, of which there's too much to read, tell us some of the most heartwarming awards that you have received for all of your work.
Well, I'm very proud of the medical missionary work that I've done.
Tell us a little bit more about that. We haven't gotten into that.
I started a program at UCLA. I met the father of Mexican anesthesia, and we became buddies, and he invited me every year to come down to Mexico City or to Cancun, where they had meetings. And I came up with the idea of his choosing the one or two best residents in the country, and they would be offered a fellowship at UCLA. And so I did that for many years, and every year I would go back and meet my former fellows. And then the Mexico City earthquake occurred, and 11 of my former residents or fellows died.
No.
And they were trapped in the earthquake.
Were they in the same hospital or just different places?
Yeah, they were at this. It was the same hospital, Mexico City General Hospital. Actually, one of my faculty was there at the time of the earthquake, and her brother, whom I brought her to America, and I brought her brother to America. Her brother called me to tell me that he hadn't heard from her. She was due home the next day. Fortunately, she was safe, and she came, and she described what happened. And I picked up the phone and called Dr. Armin Hammer, who had been a patient of mine. And I said, Dr. Hammer, this is Dr. Katz. Do you remember me? He said, of course I have to remember you. You know, you had my life in your hands. What can I do for you? I said, well, I know you're a great philanthropist. I know you have a lot of interest in Mexico. I want to do something for the earthquake. And he said, come over for lunch. And I came over for lunch, and I said, this is what has happened. He was able, there were still communications available between Occidental Petroleum in Mexico and in LA. So I was able to communicate, and I talked to some friends there, and I talked, you know, by telegraph, and I said, you know, what do you need? The answer came back, everything. I wrote back, can you be more specific? What I was able to do was get about $5 to $6 million in medical equipment that they needed, and I got Dr. Hammer gave me his airplanes, and we flew down to Mexico. We made many flights bringing equipment down, and once you do one earthquake, you know, the President of Mexico gave me a presidential citation for my work in the earthquake, and subsequently, once you do one earthquake, you become the expert in earthquakes. And so I was called for the Armenian earthquake, I was called for the Iranian earthquake, and I just continued to do that. It's very, very rewarding,
it's marvelous,
rewarding work.
Marvelous story. I'm so glad to hear about it. I really didn't know that you'd been doing that. That's wonderful.
Very, very, you know, I don't advertise it. Very few people know about it, but yeah.
Ron, in your latter part of your career, you have become more and more interested in medical malpractice litigation, and not just getting up and giving testimony, but in studying the whole field of testimony and how it affects justice and that sort of thing. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
In 1962, Manny Papper called me into his office and said, there's this malpractice case I've been asked to be an expert in, and I'm busy, so I want you to do it. And I said, sir, I don't want to get involved in this dirty work with these mean, nasty lawyers. And he said, Ron, if people like you and I don't do it, it'll leave it to the charlatans, and that's why there's such bad testimony. So you're going to do it for two reasons. One, because you'll be honest, and two, I'm your boss and I said so. And I said, yes, sir, I'd be happy to do it. When can I do it? And I did that case, and subsequently got more and more cases, and the lawyers keep track of that. They track what cases you are, and I ended up doing a lot of cases. I do about 75% defense, and I do 25% plaintiff. I had one famous case where a lawyer, I was defending a former resident, and the attorney said to me, Dr. Katz, you're defending Dr. So-and-so. Didn't you, several years ago, testify against him in a malpractice case? And I had to say, yes, sir. And you won that case, you know. I said, yes, we won that case. He said, and here you are defending him now? How come? And I said, it's very simple. When he's right, he's right. When he's wrong, he's wrong. And that's the approach that I've taken. The people who track cases tell me that I do more defense cases in the state of California than anyone else
in anesthesia.
In anesthesia, right.
And pain-related stuff.
Yeah, and you know, one lawyer was foolish enough to ask me, you know, well, because I don't get the money. I give the money to the university or to charity. And one of the lawyers, you know, incredulously said, so you don't get paid for this and you do this? You know, how come you do it? And I said, well, as a lawyer, you would have trouble understanding that, sir. But number one, I learn a lot by reading these cases, and I use them as teaching tools. And it pays good money, which I donate to charity. And some people Sunday night, you know, read Agatha Christie novels, figure out who done it. I read malpractice cases and try and figure out who done it. So it's, you know, there are some very good people doing it. There are some not so good people doing it. And what I tried for many years was to get the ASA to establish a registry like the neurosurgeons do, so that if someone, you know, lies, and believe me, I have a stack of dishonest testimony. In fact, the ASA 15 or 20 years ago asked me to give a lecture on outrageous testimony. And I kind of shocked people. First I talked about outrageous testimony by plaintiff experts, but then the second half of my lecture I talked about outrageous testimony by defense experts. So it occurs on both sides, and I felt that there should be an organization to review testimony that's outrageous and censure people, and I'm pleased to say that it's finally happened. It took about 15 years, but finally there is a mechanism now to review outrageous testimony.
Well, again, you were prescient, and you also had the well-earned stature to have people listen to you about your ideas. I think that's marvelous. Ron, this has been such a marvelous, pleasant discussion this afternoon. I'd like to go on for hours and hours. I can't remember when Ted Stanley has been so quiet. And so I'm going to turn to him and say, Ted, we're going to summarize. And I guess I'd like to ask you, I have my own opinions. I'd like to ask you what your opinion are some of the greatest accomplishments and contributions of our friend Ron.
Well, I think Ron was a great influence on a lot of young people. As a resident at Columbia, I had almost daily contact with him, and it dramatically influenced my life. There were other people at Columbia who influenced me, but Ron was certainly, if not the one that most influenced it, he was right up there. And the attitudes of that institution when I was a resident inspired me to be an academic. I wanted to be like Ron and some of the other people at Columbia. So, and this of course continued when Ron went to UCLA and was a chairman there, and even after that when he was at USC. That's always been the case. He influences people. People are attracted to him. Sometimes he is amusing because he makes what seem like outrageous statements, and you think, that's wrong. I can't believe that. And then, you know, time shows you that if he's not exactly right, he's a whole lot more right than he's wrong. And so that's, and some people actually don't like that about Ron Katz, that he can make these outrageous statements, and oftentimes, like the sodium nitroprusside, like a lot of these things, and they turn out to be really important accomplishments. I think Ron's approach to research was a dramatic influence on me and my approach to, because I tried to copy him in many, many ways, that there were elements that you could learn from every patient. And so that was part of the things that many of the things that I accomplished, I followed Ron. And you know, I think that while he was famous for his neuromuscular work and his nitroprusside work and all the other things that we've talked about, to me, the most profound thing, because it happened to me, noticing this difference between responses to a drug in one population versus another population was a very impressive thing to me. So if you wanted to point out a paper or a couple of papers, to me that was the most. Other people would think differently, but he had so many accomplishments that they all, as a collection, are an impressive list of accomplishments. So, and as a person, and you know, I see Ron probably 2 or 3 times a year, and we keep up this friendship and inspiration. And of course, there's a lot of teasing that goes back and forth, but it's been a marvelous friendship, and he's been one of my most important mentors.
Well, I can contribute my few seconds to say that my evaluation of Ron is very similar to yours. I'd probably say it's shorter. I'd simply say I admire Ron's compulsion to inquire, his compulsion not to seek the accepted as the final answer, and his ability, like the Pied Piper of Hamelin, to influence others, to assume, others would include one Theodore H. Stanley, to assume that same attitude toward medicine and toward anesthesiology. Okay, now we've told you what you're good for. You tell us what you think you've done in life. Well,
first of all, there's something you haven't asked me that I have to say. Whatever success I've achieved, I owe to a lot of people. But outside of my parents, there are 2 people we really need to talk about, and one everyone knows. One is Manny Papper. He was my chairman. He was my friend. I had breakfast with him 2 weeks before he died. The other person to whom I owe a great deal was Sushin Nai. He was my research mentor and my friend. And without Manny and Sushin, I wouldn't have accomplished anything at all. I'm pleased at what Ted said. If people ask me, you know, what am I proudest of, it's a very easy answer. I'm proudest of the number of professors and chairmen of academic department that I've helped train. I believe more than anyone else living today. I'm equally proud of non-chairmen who have had great academic careers, you know, like Ted and many others. I'm also very proud of the fact that numerous chairs of clinical departments throughout California are former residents of mine. So to sum it up, the thing I'm most happy about is the wonderful people that I've trained and who've gone on to become leaders one way or another. And I think that's what we're put on this earth for, is to teach other people and have them pass it on to the next generation.
Ron, you don't know this because you probably haven't viewed all these tapes. I've asked this pet question of mine to almost every one of our recent interviewees, to a person. They've answered it the same way as you. Not the knighthoods, not the certificates, but the pleasure they've had in helping younger people find their way in academic medicine. And I want to thank you for your inspiration for all of us, for your contributions to not just anesthesia, but to the practice of medicine and to humanity. And I think that you are truly a humanitarian, even more important than your ability to be a good banker. Thank you, Ron. Thank you so much. And thank you, Ted.
Oh, it's
thank
my
you
pleasure.
so much.
It's my pleasure.
And that's all we have today.
you.